Hey, welcome back, everybody. We are super excited today because a friend, a mentor, somebody with a tremendous legacy in the field, our friend Sheridan Blau, who I've known for 25 years. I know, Penny, you've known Sheridan for a long time. Sheridan, I just recently spoke at Kate in California, and I told this story of attending a workshop that you gave 25 years ago on different levels of reading and how that just really, I think, was the impetus for me eventually writing deeper reading. And this idea that people say, well, one and done workshops are a waste of time, and I'm here to say, I can name three or four off the top of my head that changed the trajectory of my teaching career, and yours was first 25 years
That's
ago.
nice to hear.
And I just wanted to make sure I had it straight because you have the longest title of anybody I've ever met. So I wrote it down. Sheridan is the professor of practice in arts and humanities and the coordinator of the Teachers College program in English education and the teaching of English at Columbia University.
Well, I'm not coordinator anymore.
Okay. Well, and those of us who've known you a long time know that you are also a long-time writing project director in Santa Barbara. You're the former president of NCTE. So really a towering figure. When I think about when I read this 20 years ago, when it came out, just what an incredible influence that had on me as well. And I was jealous that you got to go, I think, to France to write it while the rest of us were grinding away in the classroom every single day.
Yeah.
But we want to talk a little bit today. Penny and I saw you at UCI a few years ago, and I took literally 3 pages of notes on some of the things that you said. So I'd like to maybe just throw out 1 or 2 of the comments that you said and just kind of have you spin off of that. Okay. One of the things you said is that schools are a terrible place to learn. What? Maybe that needs a little more context, but where were you going with that thinking?
I frequently say that teaching is the enemy of learning. I've been trying to write about this lately, actually. Well, first, let me say about schools. When I say that, I don't mean that teachers are of no value. I know that in your classrooms, you've retired now, but I know the classes before you retired, good things are happening and people are learning. But I don't think that what you're doing is what the schools particularly want you to do. That is, the schools as institutions want you to prepare people for tests. They want you to teach people things. And what schools are about is knowledge. And not only knowledge, testable knowledge, which really isn't necessarily knowledge. It's just an ability to say back to a test what some teacher said to you. And I think, my general take on this is that that kind of knowledge, well, I'll go further. Let's go to the Garden of Eden for a minute. Let's go to the Garden of Eden, where what's forbidden is knowledge, right? And certainly in Milton's account, right? What you can't have is knowledge. But what the hell does that mean that you can't have knowledge? Since in the Garden of Eden, at least in Milton's account, they're learning every day. But I read that story to indicate that knowledge is the enemy of learning. That especially the knowledge that you get from a tree by eating something, you can't eat knowledge, which is the same thing as saying you can't take somebody else's knowledge as your own, right? It's interesting that knowledge grows on a tree. And that's how knowledge grows in us. It has to grow in us, which is to say we have to learn it if it's actually our knowledge. The knowledge we take from somebody else isn't ours. It's still theirs. And the problem with it is if you believe that's knowledge, then you hold it as if it's knowledge, but you don't actually know it. And it keeps you from learning because you trust that rather than your capacity to learn. And I think when you don't have a capacity to learn, you're dead. And so I'd argue that the story of the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is a story of the danger is if you eat that fruit, you're going to die, which is really to say you'll stop learning. And what I want to say about schools is that I think that schools are places that buy into that myth of knowledge as what we need, where it's not, we might need it, but the only real knowledge is the knowledge that you get from learning. And that means that you're constantly getting knowledge. And which is also to say that your knowledge is never finished. But if you take it from somebody else, it's finished because it never was yours to start with, and you hold on to it, and you have this false notion that now you know. One of the questions you sent me earlier, I think, was what do I know now that I wish I'd known when I was a young man? I think it's something like that it isn't my knowledge that's of value to students. It's my capacity to learn, which is what I have to help them develop. So, what was your first question?
No, wait. We got to talk about this. We're like 3 minutes in and my mind is like exploding over here. And welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm just so excited.
I know. It's why schools are bad. It's why I say schools are terrible places.
Yeah.
Schools are not interested in learning. They're only interested in knowledge. And in that sense, I think they are horrible places for people to learn. And when teachers work with students, as I think you do, to help them learn, you're working against the culture of the school. Remember the book Teaching as a Subversive Activity?
I
Postman
do.
And Weingart. I think it's true that good teachers have to be subversive. They have to work against the culture of schools. And I don't see any evidence that schools have ever been any different. It seems to me that throughout the history of not only of education, but of pedagogical thinking, starting with Socrates, it seems to me, there's always been a kind of opposition to the standard model of teaching that, and Jim Moffat at the end of his life gave up on schools essentially.
Mm-hmm. I've had people tell me that. Even from Herbert Cole's I Won't Learn From You. I learned so much from books like that just said this institution is not designed to do what you believe is valuable. And working against the culture of schools has been the story of my teaching life. And I think that what you're talking about, and the way I'm hearing it, that's why I want to check myself. What I say to my students every fall is, I'm going to set up conditions for you to do your best thinking in reading and writing. That's really what my job is. And I'm going to lead you by showing you what I do as a reader and writer. It's not what I think you should do, but rather what I do. I'm trying to make that public. But more than anything, I want you to develop systems that work for you and to believe in yourself. I always say that I am developing confidence as much as anything. And that's what I kept hearing in that opening answer you gave, is that when we take someone else's knowledge, there is no confidence in that. My students know they're playing a game and have been for years, where they take someone else's thinking and pretend it's theirs and mold it into these essays that people say they value, and they get good grades on them. And then they're turned loose in college to respond to an author's thinking, wide open, and they'll say to me, like, what am I supposed to write?
And they feel fraudulent. They know that there's something fraudulent about their knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember when we were in UCI, when we sat in your workshop, Sheridan, you gave us a poem and had us read it a number of times, and then you had everybody write about it. And I don't remember how you phrased it, but basically you were trying to get at the idea that the mission of the teacher is not to have the kids guess what you think and to parrot what you think, but that there's many, many ways. And I think the word you used was meaningfully, that you can meaningfully respond to a poem or a book or a short story. Yeah.
And I think the issue is for you. Part of this is being in a community. That is for you to use each other and yourselves and to be, and I think what I was also pushing was being aware of your questions more than the answers. What are your questions? Because they'll drive you to keep discovering. And Penny, I want to say too that what I hear you talking about is that classrooms need to be places where you provide opportunities for learning.
Yeah.
You put students in situations where they're doing things, and these are opportunities for learning. And what you do is assist.
Right.
You sometimes assist. When I first came to Santa Barbara, it may be my second year there. I was already very suspicious about teaching, and I gave a lecture. I was invited to give a lecture in the summer, and I called my lecture on. I'm trying to remember the exact title, on the advancement of learning through the abolition of teaching. And my argument was that teaching gets in the way of learning. But what I didn't know at the time is I didn't have another model. I couldn't figure out, what does the teacher actually do? And I remember talking about learning, and that learning was important, but I didn't know what the teacher could do. I was figuring it out in my own classes at the time, but it wasn't until I read Vygotsky that I saw a good model. And that, what Vygotsky says, a teacher can assist a kid in doing what he can do with help. And what a kid can do with help today, he can do by himself tomorrow.
Yep.
So it does provide a place for a teacher, which is to help kids, to assist them. But you have to be very careful not to be getting in their way. And even Vygotsky says a better person to give assistance is another kid who's just a step ahead of the first kid.
Right. It's sometimes the teacher's so far ahead, right? Sometimes it's better to hear it if somebody's kind of in their same
right.
realm.
Which is the argument for group work, which is the argument for why you want to put kids in group all the time. Let them learn from each other, a much better way.
Well, and yeah, this idea that, teachers are not simply information dispensers, but both what you and Penny are talking about is the other complete side of that. And since Penny brought up the idea of writing, one of the other things that you said at UCI that I thought was really interesting is that you said starting with a thesis for the foundation of academic writing is not the right approach. A thesis shuts down learning. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny that I'm not sure that everybody all the people who teach writing buy that notion. But what's fascinating to me is that early in my time at TC, one of the things that's wonderful for me about TC is we have this huge group of doctoral students. So and most of them are classroom teachers. I mean, virtually all of them have been and have to have been, but many of them are still teaching. And so they're English teachers, and they demand that the students have a thesis, which is the standard way of operating. And when we get dissertation proposals from those students, they often tend to be getting, I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to prove. And we say to them, and I mean, I've listened to my colleagues too talk about this and saying, this isn't a dissertation proposal. This is an argument proposal. A dissertation is research. We don't care what you want to prove. We care what your questions are. And what's interesting to me is I think many of my colleagues haven't translated that into what's wrong with academic writing in high schools and even in colleges. Excuse me. So I just think it's a fact. I mean, I've written against the thesis for many years, only in the argument that I thought it wasn't conducive to learning. But what's interesting is it gets outlawed when you get to the dissertation and you're a doctoral student. No thesis, even though we still call it a thesis, which is incidentally a hangover from the early days of doctoral dissertations. And you may know that they were argumentative. The history of doctoral dissertations is they used to be literally defenses, and people would actually, I mean, people got stabbed there's a history of this. There were fist fights during the Middle Ages and early Renaissance that in a doctoral dissertation, in a thesis defense, people would fight, literally have battles. It seems to have changed once they let women into the universities. It became less antagonistic.
Can I just do a little bird walk here just for a second? Is
Yeah,
that okay?
sure.
One of my treasured things in my library here is the dissertation that Donald Graves wrote, and it's bound, and it has his hand-drawn tables and charts and the data he was getting. And
wow.
And the reason that I treasure it so much is that it really was about learning. His title in the Ford Foundation study was Balance the Basics, Let Them Write. How much kids were learning how to read from writing, right? And then he entered this doctoral work with the question of what if we try what Murray's doing with college students, with first and second graders. Just that idea, we are going to go into, and what I love about the tapes, because Newkirk and I watched them all to create that kind of collaborative work of editing his stuff, is that he's sitting with teachers, and teachers will say, what should we do next? And he'll say, let's think about that together. He never was the answer man. He was always, your students, and let's just propose what we think might work, and then let's do it. And Mary Ellen Giacobbe and the others who worked with him through that, Lucy Calkins, and all of these great minds wrestling with what's the next best thing. And I think that discovery is in stark contrast to the surety everyone's looking for now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it hurts.
I envy you being there. It's so wonderful. I mean, that place in those years was
Yeah.
so spectacular, interesting, and productive. It changed the whole world. It changed the world of writing for everybody.
Yeah,
That
definitely.
group.
Well, the discussion also reminds me of George Hillick's in a way, because Hillick says you don't start with a thesis statement and then go answer it. He says that argument arises from inquiry, right?
Right.
So you study the thing first.
Right.
And then, okay, I've studied this thing. Now, what is an argument I might want to make? That's a very different approach than the teacher saying, here's the question.
Yeah, it's true, although George still liked arguments.
Yeah.
And the other thing is there is a place for an argument. There's obviously, we need arguments, not only for legal reasons, but there are times when I want to make an argument about why teaching is a bad idea. So if I write about it, I'm going to be making an argument. And so George was right, quite right in saying argument is still a really important, mode of discourse. But it's not the only one, and it's not the only one for the academic world.
Uh-huh.
Say more about that.
Well, I mean, I got, I had a minor argument with the National Writing Project when they introduced this. They had a major project on teaching argument to kids. And my argument to them was that if you want to teach one mode of discourse, don't teach argument, because I do think it's not conducive to learning. I think in George's, I think there are times for an argument, but I do think it's not, it suggests you already know all the answers, for one thing, when you're going to make an argument. I debated as a kid in high school, I remember, and you had the answers, and the idea was to beat the other. You didn't have to even believe in it. It was to beat the other people by making better arguments. And what's that have to do with learning? It seems to me that
what would
it has to do with getting a kind of knowledge you use and use it as a weapon.
Sorry, what would you have substituted if they had focused on one thing? What would it have been?
You mean in debate?
No, when you said that you wish they hadn't chosen argument.
I see. I would have argued for something like discovery writing, or writing to to explore an idea. Writing is inquiry. Writing so that you learn, that emphasizes how much you're going to learn from the writing, from doing the writing, and you'll change your mind.
Change your own mind as you're writing it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about this, Sheridan, is my guess is there's a lot of people who are listening to this who think that quote unquote college writing or academic writing is very narrowly defined
As argument.
Yeah.
And it sometimes is. I mean, I do know that happens sometimes, but I did a little, I think I even talk about it in my book. I did a little sort of experiment. I looked at articles in journals for English professors. And I think I looked at 19 or 20 articles, and most of them didn't have a thesis in the ordinary sense. I found a couple that did, but most of them were explored problems, took up a problem. How are we going to work with this problem? Somebody say, well, that's a thesis, that there's a problem. I don't know if that's a thesis, but and explored it, or they worked from questions or problems or things that didn't fit. And my suspicion is, I should test this, that 40 years ago, most of the articles in those same journals would have had a thesis and have been arguments. I think there's been a progression in the intellectual community toward discovery and examining problems, and making things much more open. So if you go back to the Middle Ages, it was an argument, and you were to defend it, and people would be violent with one another, and gradually that moved to something that was more peaceful. And even it's my understanding that the National Forensic Society, which sponsors debates in high schools, no longer has debates that are winning. That they actually encourage, I forget, discovery or compromise or something. They've given up the idea of I guess what we used to call it. You take the I'm getting the terms in my ancient memory. What's the term when you either break, you're positive or negative? What's called, what's that called in debate? The affirmative side, or the the other one, the negative side.
I got to tell you, my competitive nature doesn't like this at all, because debate was like my thing, and I
Yeah.
wanted to win.
Right.
But I totally think you're right. It
Yeah.
should have been that.
And something else I'd say is it might be great for teenagers. Maybe, I mean, I do think there's an issue of maturity here. There's an issue of maturity in the culture, right? Starting in the Middle Ages again, right? That academic discourse was debate. It was fierce. You'd fight. You'd actually have physical battles. It became more peaceful when women were around. You didn't have to fight so much. But I mean, today, a defense of a dissertation, when you go into a defense, nobody's defending because nobody's offending. It's a discussion.
I think one of the problems that Penny and I write about a lot too, Sheridan, is when you have a thesis statement and you have your 3 reasons and your conclusion, there's no decision making there, right? And then when you get to Penny's class at Plymouth State University, or you get to your class at Columbia University, and that kind of writing is not valued, and kids have not had any history in making those decisions that writers have to make, that's why the dropout rate is so high.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so.
Well, and to stay with that for a second, Sheridan, I now read the 4 C's as more often than I read English Journal. And I've always read RTE research and the teaching of English. I think NCT's publications are amazing. But what I have noticed is that the 4 C's is way freer. So the college level journal has more freedom in it, way more freedom than the high school focused journal. And it's true in classrooms as well.
That's a great observation. That's a great observation. I love
freedom when it comes to writing.
But the kind of writing
for sure. You wouldn't believe some of the very cool constructions of story and all kinds of things that I've seen in that journal. And then I think how much freer I was the minute I moved to campus. I wanted to stay with the population I had, which was seniors. So I got them 3 months later, and I have every freedom I can imagine. I can do whatever I think is best to raise readers and writers and just help them find some confidence. But if that existed for teachers in high school, I think we could move faster towards authentic reading and writing experiences.
So the question is, why doesn't it?
Right.
Why doesn't it? And I mean, my sense is from our students here, they will often say, I think this is right. I'm learning things I'd like to do in classrooms, but I can't do that.
Right.
And they can't, and it's becoming worse because they're under surveillance more than they ever were. So that schools are getting worse in that sense because they're more, I guess they're more afraid. They're more afraid that they're more afraid of because it's obvious that they're failing. So they have to succeed, and they have to succeed by making people have better test scores or something, as if that's going to prove success.
Is that what you mean by surveillance?
Well, my understanding is they're literally under surveillance. They're visited very often. That people come into the room. That I've been hearing about classrooms in New York in which people have to be on the same page. They have to be teaching the same books and literally in the same. And teach. I mean, who would want to become a teacher in such a place? I'm not surprised, of course, that fewer people are coming into the profession. So schools, it seems to me, are actually sort of on a death march. They're trying to destroy themselves. And it's horrifying. I mean, should we be against schooling? I don't want to be against schooling. And we had a hope that charter schools would do something better. And it's my impression that maybe some are, but my general impression is they're worse because they've moved the business of testing to an extreme. They have to prove that they're better, and they're going to prove it by having higher test scores. So it's only about test prep, which means it's really not about learning at all. And I mean, as I said, Moffat really sort of gave up in schools in his last books, thought it was hopeless. And there's a good argument for that. And I've been thinking a lot about it lately. It may not be that it's hopeless. It may be because if you think of the history of the world, it seems to me that this conflict has always been there in every generation. and it doesn't seem to change much. And maybe it's sort of like, I'm hesitant to say this, but it's sort of like notions of morality and notions of goodness and notions of kindness, and the idea that human beings should love each other and that we should take care of each other and that we have responsibilities to each other and to the world and to the planet. Well, this has been a problem for the entire history of humankind, and it's not as if the great mass of people agree with those positions. And we have to hope maybe more do than used to, but it's always been a kind of losing battle. And maybe education is a losing battle in the same way.
It reminds me, Penny, of the time Nancy Atwell said to us, what is up with Americans' aversion to pleasure? You know, like, why don't we approach the teaching of reading and writing through that lens, which Penny, you know, always has done, through the lens of joy and pleasure, right? The irony, of course, is if you do that, the kids become better readers and writers, and if you jam them down the test pathway.
But everyone always says they don't need to have fun. They need to work harder. They use that rigor word again and again and again. And you go, what is rigorous about stealing someone else's thinking and pretending it's yours? Nothing.
Yeah, and as if they don't recognize that the people who work hardest are the people who are playing, who are right. That children work hardest at play, and adults. You know, when we're writing, we're also playing, and if we're not playing, then it's no good at all.
We made that point in our chapter about digital composition, that kids will spend hours and hours and hours. That rigor doesn't mean I hate it. Rigor means I like it so much, I'll spend a lot of time.
That's right. With true rigor. And it's the same thing as discipline. True discipline comes from the inside. What comes from the outside isn't discipline at all. It's tyranny.
Yeah.
Wow.
I knew this was going to be great.
Yeah. So
I just fascinating.
I was so anxious to have this conversation that I jumped in, didn't even introduce Penny. I just started going right away. So my apologies, Penny. But I just love your thinking, Sheridan. And you know, I want to advocate, if you haven't read the literature workshop, it's a real mind bender. And I don't know if you have time on your plate, Sheridan, but it may be time for like a second edition.
People keep telling me that.
Okay.
I bet.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I think what keeps me from doing a second edition is if I'm going to put my time into work, I want to do something new. I want to do something.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have chapters I could add, I guess, but
sure.
You know, I think the thing I'd like to end to tell everybody though is that you do still go out and speak at times. That they need to hear you, because what you did for Kelly and I at that simple, you know, hour and a half we were in your breakout session at the writing project was, it made us both go, wow, what can we do with all of this thinking? You know, I have pages and pages, but that's many journals ago. And we sat down together and talked about what you had taught us that we wanted teachers to know. And that is what teachers seek when they go to a workshop. Please help me think, and you help us think.
You know, I don't go to do workshops anymore for a variety of reasons, mostly that I don't go into any rooms that are crowded inside. Because of my age, and I have some lung problems, and I had a lobe of my lung removed a year or so ago. Anyway, so I'm real careful, but I've had the opportunity in the past year or two to do some nice workshops on Zoom. I did 10 days with the Ministry of Education in Singapore, which was great fun working with Singapore teachers.
Oh yeah.
And also last year I did a lot of work with the Success Academy schools, which had a bad reputation. I hadn't heard good things about them, but I like them. I don't know if you had any connection to them. Kelly, did you ever? They're quite impressive. Anyway, so I do manage to get some workshops to do some.
There are a lot of people who would love to hire you Zoom. I mean, I think that's great. It's a great option.
I'd like to do something with all three of us someplace on Zoom.
That'd be fun too.
Ooh, let's do it.
Thank you so much.
We need more conversations like this. I'm really delighted to have them.
Thanks for giving up your time and your thinking. We really appreciate it.
A great pleasure. I appreciate talking to you.
Thank you, everybody who joined us today, and we'll be back tomorrow.
And I hope to see you guys. Keep in touch.
Thank you.